In this video, I'm going to show you how you can create a drum beat from scratch. And while the final result will be a typical R&B drum beat, I'm going to explain why certain placements in rhythm sound good. So if you learn these principles, you will be able to create your own drum beats for any style of music. So the foundation of any drum beat is the kick and the snare. So anything else, the hi-hats, the toms and the percussions are just extra decorations or extra layers. In other words, if you change anything in the hi-hats or other percussions, it doesn't really change the beat. But if you change anything in the kick or the snare, it can fundamentally change the beat. And it can make the drum beat completely different. So first, we start with the kick and place a note on the first beat of each bar. For the next step, we create a 2/4 beat for the snare or the clap. And this might be confusing because I said 2/4 beat, but as you can see, I'm placing the note on the third beat. But this is not about the exact placement of the note, but more of how it sounds in the drum beat. Traditionally, this is called a 2/4 beat. For the next step, we are placing the notes for the hi-hat. So this is how this sounds together. Now, this is a typical basic beat, and this beat can be completely enough for you. This depends completely on your style of music. In fact, you can even consider not using hi-hat, just the snare and the kick. But if you want to make this drum beat a little bit more interesting, more rhythmical, there are certain steps you can do. So let's go back to the kick. First, we started with a 1-bar loop. This means that the drum pattern is 1 bar and it repeats over and over in a loop. But now I place a second beat in the second bar in the kick, and this is how it sounds. Notice that the first bar in the kick drum is kind of like a question, and the second bar is like a response. So think about how other ways you can use this question and response in your groove. So first we started a 1-bar loop, and this is a 2-bar loop. And it sounds a little bit more interesting because it's less repetitive and less predictable. And sometimes if there's always a note on the first beat of each bar, it can also sound repetitive. So I'm going to move this note and bring it earlier. And this is an anticipation because it comes earlier than we would expect. We would expect it to be on the first beat, but it comes earlier. And this makes the beat a little bit more interesting. And this is a quarter note anticipation, by the way. And I talk more about this special kind of anticipation in my book, The Rhythm Code. But you can also make an 8th note anticipation, and this is how it sounds. Now I can take this even further and make it even less repetitive by adding one more note in the 4th bar. And this note is also an anticipated note because it should be on the 4th beat, but I make an 8th note anticipation. So this is how this sounds. Now let's talk about the snare drum, or in this case, I'm using a clap sound. And 99.9% of the time, this is a 2/4 beat. But you can also make variations with the snare, like for example, anticipating one of the notes in a 2-bar loop. And this is how it sounds. But for now, I'm going to stick with the simple 2/4 beat. Now, let's talk about the hi-hat. If you listen to this, this is the most basic hi-hat pattern. And as I said before, it can be completely fine for your music. But there are several steps you can make to make it more dynamic and more rhythmical. So in my book, The Rhythm Code, I talk about this, that it's really the rests, not the notes, but the rests between the notes that create the rhythm. So take a listen how it sounds if I delete some of the hi-hat notes. So this is already more rhythmical just by deleting some of the notes and making small rests between the notes. But let's say you want the hi-hat to be constantly playing in the song. In this case, you can make it a little bit more rhythmical by adding dynamics. And this is a pattern I usually put on my hi-hats. This pattern in the velocity kind of imitates how the hi-hat would sound if we would record it acoustically on a real instrument, so it makes it sound more natural. And you can take this even further and make it a little bit more interesting by using different sounds for some of the notes. For example, combining closed hi-hat and open hi-hats. So I took some of the notes and I put it on an open hi-hat sound, and this is how it sounds. Listen to those three notes in the open hi-hat. They kind of feel like they live a separate life. It's the same instrument playing constantly, but since the sound is a little bit different, it feels like it's a different instrument. So in other words, this sounds like a different instrument with rests between those three notes, and this makes the hi-hat more rhythmical. And I also added some rolls in the hi-hat for some of the notes. And this is more typical to hip-hop and trap music, but you can do whatever you want. If it sounds good, then it is good. That's the only rule in music. So let's listen to the final result all together. Now, this drum beat is not completely random. It follows a system. A rhythmical system I call the rhythm code, and I wrote a book about it. And if you learn this system, you will have a much higher level of understanding of what's happening in the rhythm. And not just with the drums, but with any instrument or vocal melody. If you want to learn more, subscribe and hit the thumbs up to support my YouTube channel.